Hello and welcome back to APIs You Won't Hate. My name is Mike Bifulco. I am one of your co-hosts of APIs You Won't Hate. And today I am hanging out with my good pal, Phil Sturgeon. Phil, how are you doing today?
Hello, I am good. I'm in the Netherlands and it is beautiful and sunny and there are sailboats going by the window. Fantastic. How are you doing?
There we go. I'm doing good. That means I can update the map I have on my wall of where is Phil today with a finite location for once, which is always a positive thing for me. I'm home in North Carolina right now, and have been enjoying a fairly stable few weeks of life at home for once, which has been really nice. Um, Happily, we are joined today by a new friend and guest of ours, Roy Pereira from Unified.to. Roy, it's really nice to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm in Toronto. It's a little rainy today, but quite nice spring.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've been to Toronto a handful of times, and I'm always struck by both how unbelievably nice people are to me, but also maybe needlessly from my American perspective, but wildly helpful people are. I think I must always look lost when I end up in Toronto, and someone has always pointed me in the right way in a way that's like disarming and shockingly kind to me.
Yeah, that's typically a Canadian thing. But it's funny because if you're from the rest of Canada, they'll say that Torontonians are rude. So it is a spec.
Well, fair enough. Like all things, I suppose. So, Roy, why don't you start a little bit by telling us about yourself? And of course, we want to talk about Unified, but I'd love to hear about your career, how you got to where you're at today, and the story of how Unified came about.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm, I guess, what you call a serial tech entrepreneur. I like starting companies. I've started about five of them. And it's really started right after university. I was taking computer science at university. I got really bored. I wanted to go change the world. I dropped out and I started a startup and realized after a couple of years that I had no clue how to run a business. So luckily, I joined another startup, a real startup. This was during the dot-com era. We eventually got acquired. That's when I also moved from coding into more product management as well. So that was really a great eye opener. Yeah, I went to the Valley, like a lot of tech people, hanged out there, came back to Canada, and then actually I did a bunch of publicly traded companies, but we won't get to. I'll try to forget about that. But went back into startup land, which is where I really love. I've been here ever since. I'm a very technical founder and CEO, but I have a pretty big range. But I love tech, and this is how I typically start. I typically start about thinking of what I need in the market that's missing. That's the best way to actually start a company, right?
Sure. Yeah. So, I guess that brings us then to the logical next step is what are you building now, and what was the question you were asking that you're starting to answer?
Yeah, it's interesting how I got here because when I look back at all of my startups, I really think I'm a one hit wonder. I love abstracting data and abstracting APIs and connecting different APIs to do stuff. And each company does different stuff, right? I like to do different industries and so forth. And I've done ad tech, advertising tech, where I've connected different ad servers together. The last company was scheduling, and we needed a bunch of data to schedule meetings with people. And so we did a bunch of integrations with our customers' accounts, like CRMs and so forth. And so I keep doing the same sort of architecture in terms of building out these integrations to third-party APIs. And so my last two companies were acquired. And then the last one, I was working for the acquiring company and I was thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I wanted to build out yet another SaaS application. This time it's going to be for salespeople to do something. It's irrelevant what I was going to do because I started thinking about all the data that I would need to actually build this product and data for my customers' accounts. And it really upset me because I just had done a bunch of these integrations, not just at the last company, but the previous company before that too. And I was like, I can't do another Salesforce integration. No, I just can't. And I just hit a wall. And Salesforce was the one that hit me hardest. It was like, no, I can't do that. It's just like it pains me every time I look at that API documentation. And so I actually put it on hold and I said, you know what? I'm just going to enjoy my summer. I'm not going to even think about that. It's too difficult. But then I started talking to colleagues, CEOs and CTOs, and they were telling me how much of a pain that is actually. And I was like, I know it's a pain. But I talked to a CEO that basically said, it's not just a pain, it is a revenue limitation. I can't get my engineering team to build another integration to say HubSpot or some other CRM. And our revenue has been impacted greatly. And that's when the light bulb moment hit me. And that's when I went back in. I said, this is the product that I need to build. I need to build a developer tool that allows SaaS applications to easily build in these third party customer facing integrations. Because in today's world, it's all about data and the data is everywhere. And you don't own that data. You are not the source of truth, right? And so there are existing sources of truth out there, the Salesforces of the world and sales world, Workday for HR and so forth. And so the pain that I was feeling in terms of building a new company, um, I turned that around and I said, I'm going to productize this concept and allow other apps, the other SaaS companies to easily integrate this unified API into their infrastructure, their product infrastructure, so that they can offer these customer integrations without spending a ton of time and money.
Yeah, I think that is the sort of thing that if you've built things from scratch or been on teams that have had to develop new arms of a product, you find yourself answering the same questions over and over. And maybe a good litmus for that is, are you adding the same, like, am I adding 12 API key environment variables to my project? It's probably scratching an itch that's somewhere similar to what you're doing at Unified. And in the end, I think all of the, I don't know, you pick your choice, CRM management, mailing list management, error management, all of those things tend to feel the same. The APIs are similar, but they each have their own quirks. It sounds to me like the goal of Unified is to give people the opportunity to do that without having to think about each API individually. Is that more or less right?
Totally. And we actually have that written. It's like we should get tattoos on that because that is our ultimate goal, is to not have our customers, the developers, read third-party API documentation, right? So we want to unify as much as possible for the greatest amount of use cases so that our customers only use us, only look at our API documentation, our SDK documentation, all of that, and never have to go and read a Salesforce API documentation or a Workday API documentation. And not really care what the difference between HubSpot and Salesforce is. Because in a unified API environment, that should not matter.
Yeah, so I was just having a look at this, and that felt weird in itself. That I actually, prepared for a podcast. It was styling, but I went through and had a little play around, and it was well helpful. I couldn't quite visualize how this is going to work, right? Like, oh, it's an API that's abstracted everything else ever. Is that helpful? But looking at the way you set it up, you kind of got integrations, just like it's Zapier or something like that.
It's called Zapier actually because it rhymes with happier, I was told.
There you go. I've heard Americans say Zapier, and I always wanted to complain about that, but fantastic. But yeah, you kind of set up your integrations, and the coolest thing I noticed was that it was like, do you want to use your own OAuth tokens or do you want to use ours? And I was like, oh, I could like integrate with Discord, for example, without actually having to go and register an application and set up all of my config and do all of this stuff. I could just use your keys, and then so when the users of my application want to connect with Discord, there's a little button that you've generated with a single line of JavaScript that you embed. You click on that and it opens up a whole flow of like, hey, why don't you go and connect with Discord using our tokens? That just cuts out so much time. Yeah.
Yeah, we did that because we that time to the aha moment is super important in any product. But as a developer, you have so many choices. You are Googling, how do I, do X? And you don't have a lot of time because you're on a sprint, right? And you have like a 2-week sprint cycle. And so if you can get to that, this does what I need to do. And so what we wanted to allow our developers, customers to do is to utilize our unified API to test it. And so we actually went out and we got all of our OAuth credentials, it's called technically, so that they can actually use ours would they launch their product with ours? No. And in fact, you can't, or you shouldn't. But it is a great way to test and to play around with the system. Most developers are great developers because they play with stuff, right? Until they're comfortable with it. So that's what we wanted them to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if I'm trying to sit around working out, I mean, you were just talking about when you've done 10 Salesforce integrations in a row, but when you're that person who's just starting to try and work out what CRM to use, and you've got to go and try out 10 different CRMs, you've got to set up a credential for 10 different apps to see how they go. That is incredibly annoying. And
It is setting up OAuth credentials is one of the worst things that has not been fixed, by the way. I think at some point we're going to have to take a look at that, or the industry is going to have to come up with standards. It's horrible, and we get quite a lot of support calls from customers, developers who are sort of stuck, even though we have how-to articles on it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, for sure. There's so much standardization involved in OAuth too, as to how the flows work and different processes work. But like, what's the user interface for it? I don't know. Figure it out. It's yeah, I mean, the way I've generally kind of gone about this problem in the past is using kind of installable packages when they exist. So for example, there's things like Omni that can help my specific application in Ruby on Rails. You can integrate with a bunch of different like Facebook and Twitter and all these different OAuth login things. And it will kind of generate some views for you. So you get a bit of interface kind of made up. Or we were talking on a recent episode about how there's lots of different like geocoding APIs, and you can find a geocoder PHP and it's got drivers for 10 different, APIs, things like that. There's been attempts to abstract certain verticals all over the place. But yeah, there's pros and cons to having that as a SaaS itself versus a bit of software that you're controlling. But those are very niche, auth and geocoder. Like what sort of APIs are you trying to abstract?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Phil. So there's been, I think, some unification of APIs in the past that we've seen. Authentication for sure. So you have Okta and Auth0, you have Firebase, you have Superbase. They're trying to unify them somewhat. And I think authentication is pretty well done. I mean, it's a massive market. Okta is like $2 billion of revenue a year just for authentication. But if you go back a little further, you actually see, now I'm blanking here, Plaid. There it is, Plaid as unified API for financial services, for transactions, right? How they were getting the data is a little different than what we're going to talk about because we're all talking about APIs. A lot of times Plaid was screen scraping sites, bank sites, but what they represented to their customers, yeah, I know, but their representation to their customers was a singular unified API. And I thought that was really, really interesting and smart. Of course, integrating into, say, B2B applications like sales and HR applications has been done in the past. I wouldn't call them a unified API that much. There was a couple of companies like Cloud Elements and some others that have tried to do this in the last 10 years or so. But that unification was sort of lagging. And the issue there again is if a developer has to both implement your solution, but also read the API documentation of the integration, then what sort of value are you really adding there? So I think pushing it to its maximum in terms of unification is super important for us. So to answer your question though, Phil, so we're really targeting on two, what we call clusters, categories. The HR space with HRIS, performance management, directories, and ATS, applicant tracking systems for recruiting. So that cluster is quite important for software companies that target employee benefits, for example, or anything around an employee or anything around a candidate. And that seems to be a very large market around the world. There's about 15,000 or so software companies that do target that. And it's also a really interesting industry because there are clear sources of truth, these platforms that store the employee data. especially employees. So Workday, SAP, ADP, all of those big, older software companies that have the lion's share of the market. And when you talk about, say, older or more established companies, let's call them more established, you typically are talking about an API that maybe isn't as modern as it should be. So it's very difficult to interface with, to integrate into your application and then to monitor and to maintain it. So that's one cluster that we target. We also target sales and marketing support as well. Those are also very important categories. There's quite a lot of sales software out there. If you think about sales enablement or sales cadences, reaching out to prospects and so forth, mailing list software, all of that, trying to get that customer to go through your funnel down to convert and to upgrade. So those are the two that we target today. And of course, our architecture allows us to expand into others. We've had lots of conversations, truck shipping logistics, for example, comes up sometimes. And it's like, oh, that may be a little bridge too far right now. Well, we are a small company. We want to focus.
Yeah, Roy, I'm really curious in hearing a little bit about the story of how things got started. So it seems to me that one of the challenges with building a company like this is if you're going to unify APIs, you need to start with an MVP that tackles quite a bit of surface area from an implementation standpoint. What did the very first version of Unified look like? Where did you start in this mess of unifying APIs across all sorts of industries?
Yeah, it's funny. We started with the architecture. So we're actually just 5 months old. We started in January-ish of this year, 2023. And we started with the architecture. We did the hard work ahead of everything else. And it was just based off of experience. What did we do in the past, in past companies? What worked? What didn't work? We did some research into how much time we spent on integrations in some of the last companies. And that's quite a lot. And it wasn't just building. Building actually was, I think, the easy part in terms of time management. It was actually maintaining them. APIs change all the time. Things break. Sometimes the API documentation isn't actually what the API has. And so there's all sorts of issues there. Oh, and API keys expire and auth credentials expire and so forth. So we basically started with what do we know worked, what didn't work, and we built the core architecture. And what we found was it took a long time, and we only really started building integrations in the last couple of months, to be honest. And those have been added very quickly now that we have the architecture. And so now we have 92 integrations that we've built out in the last 2-3 months. We're actually getting faster and faster at building them, but we also created, again, the core to also monitor and to manage them after they're launched and after they're connected to a customer's account. And so that's super, super important to us because we don't want it to break and not know, but also to our customers because they rely on our stuff working, right? And if it doesn't work, then why are they using us instead of having an internal team, for example?
Yeah, this is something we were talking a little bit before we hit record, and it was a good conversation and we should have just hit record. But I was talking about how I feel like there's kind of, whether it's two binary types of API developer or a bit of a sliding scale. You're talking about how there's kind of the people that just don't really care all that much about APIs and want to write the quickest, shortest, briefest happy path they possibly can, where they just get the thing and smash it through JSON decode and hope for the best. And then there's the people who are often very excited about APIs and want to build all sorts of wrappers around it. So they've got a soft dependency and make that into a mapping service instead of talking to a map and get very kind of complex about the architecture. And I'm wondering which type of customers you're aiming to target there, because I feel like neither of them could be interested, even though all of them can benefit from it. Like, how do you wedge in against those sort of people?
Yeah. We're all developers, right? And all developers feel like they can build it, right? Product manager comes in the room and says, hey, I need X. And they're like, yeah, I can build that. No worries. And even as you get more senior, you still feel like you could build it. I think maybe you have maturity and you say, well, maybe I'm going to look at alternatives, build versus buy kind of thing. Um, and so what we're finding our customers are the type that they've built it. So they know how much of a pain it is to build, but also to maintain. And really, again, that maintain part is really the thing that hits you, the tech debt. And then the fact that you don't have time to build features in your product that are differentiate your product. That's really killer because then you're disappointing your product manager, your CEO. Your CEO is complaining about lack of revenue growth and so forth. So we typically get those types of CTOs or developers coming to us. And what we're finding is that they want to expand. So they just got asked to build XYZ integration that they don't have. They have like maybe one or two. And so they need to add in because the customer requests it. And so obviously the CEO wants it, salespeople want it. But they'll add that integration, but then they also will go back and replace their integration that they built natively as well. Because once they get comfortable with the fact that this actually works better, the architecture is better done than their quick architecture that they did or lack of architecture. And so they're really happy. Like you can actually see like a sigh of relief, especially when you're having these video calls, you actually see their faces and they're like, oh my God, I don't have to think about that anymore. And so to answer your question, yes, they are like the typical developer that loves to build stuff, but is sort of reluctant to really go deep and to own it because it's not core. Like this is not what their job is. This is not what their product is. Their product does some other mousetrap thing that's cool and differentiates it. Um, Talking to a customer facing API is like not sexy and it's not really part of your core differentiator, but it's necessary. And so I think they understand that for sure. And so they're quite happy to give that off. Um, and yeah, I sort of equate it to nobody hosts websites anymore on a server in your closet. You know, we gave that up a long time ago. We gave that control up. It's like, hey, you know what? I trust AWS or Azure or Google. I don't have to think about this. I'm just going to let them do it. And now, you know, you saw with Plaid, you saw with Okta, with authentication, you know, Twilio, with SMS and voice. So there's a lot of examples out there. And so this is yet another infrastructure that we license, use a better word, but license to include in our product so that we can actually focus on our product better. And the developers understand this. They don't want to build this stuff.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's a pretty good parallel for this that most probably even non-developers can relate to in photography. That, you know, for a very long time, people who were into photography were the ones who spent their lives like studying photography and figuring out how to use a camera and like what an aperture is and buying the right film for whether they're going to be outside or inside. Then digital cameras came along and, you know, we had a little more access to things like the equivalent to this might have been when services like Okta started appearing and maybe there were a bunch of choices and the APIs were a little clunky and whatnot. But what really made things go mainstream for all of us is suddenly we all have a camera on our phone and like the UI for the camera on your phone looks like the UI for the camera on my phone. And it looks like, you know, an Android one and a Palm OS one and a Windows OS one and all those kind of look the same. And suddenly the experts on, you know, authentication and payment and HRIS and all those other things can do their thing. While the people who just need to use them in their day-to-day work can benefit from it. And centralizing these sort of APIs and giving, you know, maybe albeit a simplified API for some of these things really empowers a lot more functionality and broader adoption across the industry. What's the education side of things look like for you? Are you finding that the value proposition of like, you know, hey, maybe you someone comes to Unified for like a sales CRM integration? Are they finding their way into other bits of API facets that you're unifying, say call centers or recruiting, things like that too?
Yeah. So we call those clusters because they are sort of intertwined somewhat, or can be, depending on their use case, right? So if you're just doing sales enablement, you probably just want the CRM and maybe the enrichment APIs that we built. But if you're doing some other sales or customer-oriented software, something around the customer, you may actually want to track the call center activity of that customer, along with maybe the mailing list. I don't know. So those sometimes can intertwine, just like HR in applicant tracking systems, candidates and employees. A candidate turns into an employee, so you want a good handoff. But those two clusters don't really merge or intertwine at all. We find. But to answer your question a different way, we do have customers coming in or prospects, let's say, who are looking for a Zapier clone. And we're not a Zapier clone. We don't compete with Zapier or a no code. In fact, we are code. It's an API. You have to code with the API. We make it super simple, one line of code, but you still have to code. You're a developer. Zapier is not for developers. And we don't offer the automations that a Zapier does. And that's not our role. We're not an ETL either. We're not taking data from one database and putting it in another database. We basically don't want to add any business logic whatsoever. We want to give our customers the raw material, making it super simple for them, but they are building a product and they are controlling their business logic the way they want to. If they want to store the data somewhere, it's up to them. Not up to us. And we're not going to offer that. We're just making it super, super simple. We're focusing very much on this one problem space. I think the other confusion that happens is we get a lot of prospects coming in that want to manage their own their own accounts. So their own Salesforce account. They want to automate their Salesforce account, moving data from it to something else. And that's really a Zapier use case again, where you're managing your own accounts for your own business, not your customers' data.
Yeah, I think if I try and make it a bit more concrete, because what I've said about it so far is like you can skip OAuth2 and that's cool. But I think to talk about it a bit more, I was playing around with it and I was trying to think of like a similar kind of vibe, and it reminded me of on Ghost. I've been using Ghost a lot, the CMS, and it's super cool because like you sign up to Ghost and then it's just got this massive pile of integrations. You can click integrate, and then it asks me for my OAuth tokens as the user of Ghost, and then kind of Ghost doesn't really care about those integrations, because they could just be running through something like you. And then in the background, Ghost can be using all that data to nudge things around. So, yeah, it's kind of like that, especially with the handy little JavaScript SDK, or not SDK, the JavaScript one-liner that you've got. You can like have your embedded integrations. So I could be, it all sounded very clever in my head, but if I'm building an application like Ghost, right, and I need to add loads of integrations to it, I can just pick a bunch of your integrations, embed that one line of JavaScript, and then it's got that UI all built out with a list of all those integrations that my end user can then click on and integrate their accounts with my application. Yeah.
It's all about speed, right? The developer doesn't want to waste 3 months of their time building out an integration on the back end and then building out the front end user interface for their customers. Like all of this is common stuff. Like we're even going to come out with some other common widgets, actually. I won't go into detail, but how many other things can we standardize? That one line of code, just to back up, one of my favorite developer stories is I was running a startup, and one of my junior developers came to me and said, I have a solution to the problem that you asked me to go and solve it. And that problem was we were having a lot of fraud with our payment system, right? And so I asked him to go and find some anti-fraud solution. And he's like, I found an even better solution. It's a new payment provider and they have integrated fraud and we should switch. And I'm like, but we're using like the big payment provider. And I asked him some questions and he told me, well, it's a new startup out of Ireland. And I'm like, oh, no way. Like what? Some new startup? We're not going to put our payments through a new startup out of Ireland. And then he convinces me though, and this is the point. He's like, but there's one line of code that they gave me. Their documentation is beautiful. And I used it. I got to it working within 10 minutes and let me demo it. And it solves all of our problems. And that one small Irish startup was Stripe. And so from that moment on, I've been using Stripe. And it's because of that one line of code. And that stuck in my head. And so I wanted to have our developers have this one line of code that they can insert into their app for their customers and get it running and look like rock stars. And so that's the the background of that one line of code. It's turned into not just JavaScript, but also a React component and a Vue.js component as well. I'm building an Angular component as well.
Yeah, I think especially for, a lot of us API developer types, the sort of people listening to this podcast probably came from a mostly back-end perspective, and I might you're a bit different, but a lot of us were kind of like doing back-end and kind of vomiting something out to the front end and hoping someone would tidy it up later.
I love that. I'm gonna use that. That's exactly how I felt as well. But I think with age, you sort of understand that you need some more balance. So yeah, let's try and balance that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, hopefully there's other people too. Otherwise, I'm just admitting to being a bad developer, but I definitely am not full stack. And so things like Stripe, things like, even the Shopify buy button, all these integrations that are just like this one line of code. It's not just the one line of code. I could write 100 lines of code. It's the fact that I don't have to build a front end for this part of it, right? Like think about talking about the integrations, you've got you're building an application, you've got a list of integrations of a bunch of third-party SaaS systems that your users want to connect with for whatever reason. Building the interface for that sucks because you've got to build this whole create applications and log in here and redirect back there, and then you've got to add some webhook URLs that all need testing, and that's hard. Although we've done some podcasts about how to make that easier. And then you've got to have all of the various different forms and different things, and all of just that building that is time I could spend doing literally anything else in the world. So the fact that you've taken that interface off my hands is a huge value in itself.
But let's talk about all the stakeholders involved here, right? So we're just talking about developer, right? Which we typically only think of, right? And back-end developers, to your point, Phil, not even front-end. Yeah, forget about the front-end guys. But there's more. There's a CTO, and the CTO cares about different things than the developer, right? They care about security, for example, massive, right? And if you're building an HR software company, you really care about security because you're handling data that is super sensitive. But look at support people, because after you launch, those poor support people are going to have to talk to your customers. I'm like, hey, I'm trying to hook up to a Workday. Something's not working. So they need help as well. They need something. They need documentation. But even marketers, we don't even talk about marketing. How do we launch this thing? How do we educate the marketer to launch? What do they say on Twitter? What do they say on their release documentation for this new integration? And it's not just one integration. Like when they add us, they get all 92 today. We're going to be at 100 in a couple of weeks. But so they can launch all of them at once. And so that's a massive amount of information that they actually have to do the work on. And I would actually posit that the developer is actually the lucky one in this case, because they can build this in an afternoon. The marketer is going to have to build a ton of documentation, and the support people are going to have to build a ton of documentation in their FAQs to support all of these.
I think that an important bit of additional context to provide onto this story too is, so Phil sort of cheekily mentioned before that I come to this world from a very different perspective. The reason Phil and I met is because he was the API developer looking for a front end full stack person to clean up his vomit mess, as I think he put it before. And that's how we met, right? Like he had a bunch of really interesting ideas, and I was used to taking the data from the interesting ideas and putting it into a presentable, human understandable experience. And, if I could teleport back in time and talk to Mike from a bunch of years ago, I think the biggest thing I've learned from then is that, like, much like you don't want to keep building Salesforce integrations, I really don't want to keep building login screens. I really don't want to keep building the same payments screen, to like design the UX of how to put in a credit card number or something like that over and over. And I do think that coming from both angles of this, from a developer perspective, the value is there and it makes a lot of sense. And now in the world I'm living in now, where I'm building a company and, I'm Roy, also in the startup world these days, and requirements change quickly and needs of the team change quickly. And the thing that's on fire the most changes very quickly. And I think if you turned to me and said, like, yeah, and so the story to get your people plugged into the tools they need faster is a reasonably simple integration with documentation in one place, with value proposition for help and security and all those things. Like that, with the wisdom of time behind me, sounds a whole lot like something that maybe I should be paying attention to, and maybe perking up a little bit when something like that comes across my inbox too.
Yeah, and you're right. you can build so much, and the requirements are never over. Your product, people will always give you new requirements. So you're always going to be busy. It's a matter of how much importance and time do you want to spend on things. And I would rather spend time. So back to my previous startups, when I look back and I try and learn from my mistakes, one of my mistakes is that I think we spent too much time on stuff that wasn't core, and the customer integrations weren't core. I should have spent more time on working on feature sets that were core, that differentiated my product from my competition. So I wish I would have done more. I wish I had Unified.to to basically handle all of these customer integrations, so I didn't have to do that. And back to that one line of code. So it's not just the front end that's important. It's also the back end. We have, I think you brought it up. We have an SDK. We have a couple of SDKs. One is a TypeScript node that you can easily use, but you can use one line of code basically with that as well. If you wanted to go and say, get contacts from a CRM or employees from an HRIS system, it's basically one line of code as well. So we're trying to make it as simple as possible for both the back end and front end.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the implementation side of things too, if that's okay, Roy. From a consumer perspective, what is the hello world experience like for Unified if I'm starting to integrate with my product stack?
Right. So our end user are developers, right? So they come in, they go through a little onboarding. We try to get them to see the data from the API as quickly as possible. There's a couple of things they need to do. They need to say which integrations they're interested in, and then play around with that one line of code for that embedded directory, right? So that it shows like a matrix of available integration. So if they turn one on, they have one logo. They can click on that. They can enter in an API key if it's that, or an OAuth to screen, right? Using our own credentials. They visualize it through their customers' eyes. But once they authorize it, they also get a connection. And that's like the core object in our platform. Everything runs off of a connection ID. And it's abstracted. It's just an ID. There's no authentication associated with it. There's no integration type. It doesn't matter, right? And so from a developer, then they get to use that connection ID. We give them a little bit of curl code, which they can just copy and paste into their terminal, and it calls that API. It calls get whatever employees, contacts, whatever that integration supports, and then they actually see the data in their terminal. And so I think that's really important as a developer. There's a lot of BS out there, companies that tell you that they can do X and it doesn't, or it's really hard. And so we want to make sure that they understand that literally within 5 minutes, they're going to see data, real data in a unified API. And that data object that comes back is unified. It is one of the core benefits that we work our butts off. We expand those fields to the maximum that we can, and they're always the same format. And so as a developer, it doesn't matter where my customer's data is in, it's always going to be the exact same format, unified data model. And that's actually how we started with abstracting these data models away. That's one of our core, I think, benefits of this. And so that's what they're going to see. And then once they test that out, maybe they're testing it with their own accounts instead of their customers' accounts, hopefully. Then they have this roadmap in terms of launching, testing, and then launching it in production.
How about change management? Literally no one's favorite topic, but I'm doing it anyway. So something that seems like a benefit is that if there's, you as an application developer are building an application around an integration with some third party, and that third party releases version 2 and 3 and 4. And they're not really important. They've renamed some methods for no obvious reason, and they've added a few parameters that you're not using. But as far as Unified is concerned, like it's easy enough to update that integration. So that I'm assuming that the users of Unified don't really notice those version changes most of the time. But what happens when a big change happens and like the data is different? How much length do you go to kind of help maintain that interface? And at what point do Unified's users need to do something differently? if there's a big change?
Yeah. So as you can imagine with the unified data model, not all fields are available for all of the integrations. And we try super hard. Like there are sometimes when one API call into our system results in about 10 different API calls to the software that we're targeting, just because we're trying to collect all the data so that we can build our own unified object model. And so when those API calls change or their data changes, their format changes, whatever, our customers never see that. We do, and we actually have a lot of automated monitoring in place so that we are ahead of those changes. And that is, of course, one of our core benefits to our customers. They don't ever have to maintain that awareness. We do. So we're super hyper vigilant about that, about these changes. And we're also looking at the data coming across. Again, API documentation is usually out of date compared to what's actually happening on this API server, right? As you talked about, the front end guys typically get it last, and then the marketing people get it last. And so there's this waterfall method where the developer is way ahead of everybody else, especially the API developer. So we do have quite a lot of automation to make sure that we're always ahead. But when, let's say Workday changes their APIs or data models or anything like that, our customers will never see that change because we've already changed along with that. And we have this unified system. We do expand that model. So there aren't, it's not always static. So we will add another field, like, we'll add compensation or whatever. But that's an addition to, and it's not backwards breaking.
Okay, so whatever nonsense they're up to, you kind of strive for a unified interface that is using evolution more than whatever breaking changes they've gone with. Because there's easy examples, slightly contrived and silly, but the like usage of names I've seen in APIs before, where they're like, we used to have first name and last name, and we realized that's not how names work. So now we use name, and they like literally. So somebody somewhere just writes a bit of code that says if first name and last name, then mush them together to do name. And then you've got that covered. Or the other way around where they used to have name and they've gone, oh crap, we want to integrate with Stripe that demands first name and last name. So somebody somewhere has written a explode space. And that again is not how names work. But people do that sort of stuff. Like, are you doing that sort of thing as versions change in the background? Or are you asking users to say, hey, the data model's changed, can you update somehow?
No, so we're monitoring that ourselves. And again, we've automated that. I think the example that you just gave is a really good reason why you actually don't want to build these integrations in-house, because you're basically building an architecture that is inferior, and you're not really thinking that long. You're thinking, I only have this one integration to build. Product managers asked me to build Salesforce. I'm going to build Salesforce. And then I'm going to cut corners. Yes, first name, last name. I'm just going to add the two strings. And then something changes, and then your architecture can't handle it. Or you're asked to add in a second integration, and then your architecture really can't handle it. So we've done the homework there. We're actually going to come up with an infographic in terms of all the differences, first name, last name versus display name versus, API key versus OAuth, all of that's the differences. There are quite a lot of differences that are going to make our heads spin and are making our heads spin right now, but we've automated enough a bit with architecture that all of this works. Now, again, it's our responsibility to make sure that it is working. So if they do change first name, last name to just display name, we'll fix that before anyone notices. I think what we've seen though more often is that they'll change the object name. So they'll go from opportunity to deal or something like that. And then that's a much bigger change because the data model is completely different. And maybe the associations between the different objects that they have are now different as well. So that's a little bit more time for us to go in there and refactor that.
Yeah, I suppose some of them, I seem to remember Stripe doing something along the lines of changing payment into charge and receivable or something. And that just is a fundamental change to how it works. But I'm assuming that many of the integrations you've gone for have kind of settled down a bit. There's that early startup, everything's being renamed every 5 minutes kind of period. And then there's that it's Stripe. We're not changing this every other weekend, mate. Like there's, it kind of settles down at some point to a point. And also if they're mostly around the same verticals, I assume that a lot of them are, it's person and company and they're relatively stable domains in that sense as well.
Yeah. So part of the unified API theory is, we're not only unifying the API endpoint, right? Simple REST-based API endpoint, but we're also unifying the objects. So in the CRM space, some CRM vendors call them opportunities, some call them deals. We've chosen to use deals, but it means the same thing. Same thing with company and account. And so we tried to unify those as well. And we documented what they mean so that you can extrapolate. If you know Salesforce, then it's an opportunity, for example. And then, of course, the fields are also the same. So there's really like 3 levels that we try and unify. And in fact, there's even more unification. So authorization, we talked about a little bit of that with our one line of code to represent the embedded directory to your customers. That's for authorization. You're trying to get their authorization of their account. Most of the OAuth vendors out there have scopes, permission scopes. They're all different. There's no standardization at all there. So we've actually gone ahead and unified all of them. We've standardized all of them. And so again, you as a developer, if you need access to contacts and deals, you don't have to go and read about what scopes you need and then put in custom scopes into our authorization directory. You can just say, I need to read and write contacts and I just need to read deals. And then we'll figure that out.
So I was going to say one of the most striking things about the product altogether, which is really hard to convey through an audio medium like a podcast, is the documentation that you've put together, which is sort of a meta documentation of, like you said, 93 APIs. And I think if you're listening to the show and this sounds even remotely interesting, a really interesting activity is to go just browse API documentation on Unified.to and check out what this looks like. In practice, what it means is there are, you can look at sales CRM APIs, for example, and see a list of, I don't know, it looks like a dozen or more CRMs that are supported. And the really thoughtful way that Roy, your team has divined a nomenclature that unifies all of those things in a way that's like human understandable. I really like that you've published these, I guess it'd be like an entity relationship diagram of the way that you think of the types and how they interrelate here for the things that are surfaced in your API. And so you can kind of see, regardless of the CRM you pick, for example, there's a notion of a team and a user, and that user might have an address, or they might become a lead and turn into a user and things like that, which fully zooms you out from having to think about, is this, am I using Front or HubSpot or Drift or Intercom or all these other things? It's just getting into the meat of like, what do I need to get done here, rather than becoming an expert on the underlying principles that have been, cast upon you by the people delivering the software. Yeah.
No, thank you, Mike. Back to the Stripe example, their documentation is world-class. It's always been the best API documentation. And, I'm not saying ours are that, but we really try, and we have a new design coming out shortly, and we'll always have one, but it's really super important to have it searchable, detailed, and go from the top where you see this UML diagram so you can understand how things work together, but also go right to the bottom, like what does each field and represent and so forth. So we've tried to encompass quite a lot of data there, maybe too much, but I think as a developer, you want to have that optionality. You want to get in there quick, 5 minutes, boom, boom, boom. Oh, yes, it works. But then like when something doesn't work, you want to have the detail there. So we try quite hard to add that in. And the other thing I would say is after you build all of these integrations, like we have, I think 24 HRIS integrations right now, and we're building out quite a lot more of them right now. But after you really understand the commonality, right? There are quite a lot of differences, but the commonality in how they operate and how the relationships work. And so we're giving that back to our customers. This is our understanding of how these elements, these objects work together. And so I think that's the API documentation that I want our customers to read, and not Salesforce or Workday or anything like that.
I suddenly have this overwhelming feeling that you can unplug yourself and see the matrix of how all these things are actually planned from behind the scenes. And like, you've got a fourth dimension of vision for these things that I would love to develop. It's really fascinating.
I'll give you a bad dad joke. Okay. Like I always tell people that my second language is API.
Mm.
Because I really feel like I could sit and understand an API within a matter of minutes. And it's just because I've always done this, right? It's 10,000 hours, right? And so if you've looked at APIs all of your career, you sort of are looking for specific things. You understand concepts. So yeah, I think this is the company that I think I've always should have built.
I'm interested in the kind of the way that you talk about it. You've unified these things, right? You kind of looked at lots of different companies and you've come up with unified nomenclature, and I assume a team as well, not just you. But I'm wondering about things like standards. So schema.org is something I know that some of our listeners are super excited about. It comes up on Slack all the time. Not JSON schema. It's a different usage of schema. Schema.org is like a large number of people have sat down and gone through everything. They've got person, which has got address, additional name, alumni or birthplace, death place. And then place is another type, which has various different events and coordinates and loads of properties, address, geo, whatever. An organization which has address and employees and fax numbers, and I'm just reading random fields. But then they have really obscure stuff, which is like biochem entity. I can't be like, okay, and medical entity and a bunch of other things like that. So there's some really useful stuff and some, potentially useful stuff to a tiny slice of the population. But have you thought about working with something like schema to say, instead of like, this is what unified think that, this is what you think a person should be, maybe it could be your job to convert things to person and back again, so that you're working with the standard interface that is standard, not your standard.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have two comments on that. One is I love standards. In fact, in a previous life, I was part of the IETF, which is the Internet standards body, coming up with standards for virtual private networking, for example. So I see how an industry explodes once you have standards and all of the companies within it can communicate. So I'm all for that, and I'd love that. There's not that many standards for, say, CRM. And so we had to build and abstract away that. I think that will happen over time. There are standards like SCIM, for example, which is for HR user provisioning, which has a user object. It's not bad. But I think that the comment that I would make to your schema example is that if you make something too broad, too big, then it sort of loses value, right? And so if you define a user object for everything, then it's too big. And so what we've done, and you can take a look, like, so there's actually a section on our API documentation called like user objects, which is like, hey, we have a bunch of user objects. They're all called different things like contact or employee or candidate or customer, but they're specific to the actual use cases. So a CRM contact is different than an HR employee object, which is different than maybe a ticketing customer object. And they're done for a purpose. They share quite a lot of information, fields, same fields, name, email, that kind of stuff. But because they're for different use cases, they're going to have different fields that are relevant for that use case. And so that's the angle that we picked. We don't want to add noise by having this meta massive user object that contains everything under the sun. So that's, we can argue whether or not that was the right way of doing it, but that's
cool. I had to ask because I knew someone would shout at me about why you just use schema.org if I didn't. So thank you for preemptively answering them.
Yeah, no, I would love to use standards, and I would actively promote and be active in defining those standards. Yeah, that is something actually that we are looking forward to doing at some point.
That's very cool. Yeah, I mean, it just every time it's come up, like Stoplight brought it up a little while ago when I was working for them, and they've got customers that have 500 different models for a flight, and it's the same company just has 500 different flight models. So things can get wildly varied. So they've kind of gone with the approach of let's help companies standardize themselves so that they have like one thing to represent a flight. And then once there's lots of different companies that represent flights, then you can start to standardize those. But if everyone's got snowflakes in their own home, then it's not going to be something you can standardize. So that makes sense.
You're right. You look like a company like Postman. Postman is growing very fast. Why aren't they trying to standardize some of these things, right? README.io, Spotlight. There's a bunch of these API management companies that are looking more at customer-facing APIs instead of just internal APIs, like the API management company like Kong. So I think we will get there. I'm not sure that there's a standards body out there right now, but maybe, schema.org, for example, could facilitate that. And like I said, already there's a Skim that has tried to do that, although it's definitely not unified. There's quite a lot of changes and differences within each one of those implementations.
So, Roy, I realize we've been chatting about your product for a while here. A couple of things I want to touch upon is if some of the folks listening to the show today are interested in jumping in and playing with Unified, I noted on your site that at the moment, at least, it lists that you are, sounds like either pre-launch or in sort of an early access mode. What's the best way to get access?
Yeah, we're, I would say soft launch. The entire platform is operational. It's very scalable, very, very secure. We're not storing any data. We have a ton of security functionality in there, even to store access tokens in your own database and so forth. But you can just self-register. We have a free plan to test out the system. It's free forever until you want to launch. You want your own identity. You don't want Unified's identity in your app. And so anyone can go to Unified.to and no, we are not based in Tonga, the South Pacific island of Tonga, but it's a cool domain short. But we also do have a promo code. If you guys want to test this out, we're giving out 3 months free. And that promo code is just APIs you won't hate. 2023, all in capital, no spaces. So that's a really easy way to actually test this and put it into your product. And of course, looking at our Twitter feed, Unified_API, we always post in Twitter and on LinkedIn as well. And we try and post quite a lot because, as you can see from our change log, we are adding a ton of new integrations and a ton of features within our objects, like new fields and so forth. So we've definitely figured out a way to automate the building of integrations and to put it into a very scalable architecture.
Yeah, that's great. It's I think the kind of thing that is very encouraging too, to show developers like the price to try is free, and therefore theoretically the value proposition should be clear from there, right? Like if the product speaks for itself, then it's easy to get started free and kind of dive in.
Yeah, and I think pricing model is really interesting that we didn't really talk about. We're talking about APIs and technical stuff, which I don't think we did enough of, but I think pricing is so important because you want this to work with your pricing model. If you're charging your customer $20, you don't want to pay $20 a month for something like this. So we've been startup operators for a very long time. And that was something that we thought about really hard. We actually took a lot of time at coming up with a pricing model that would work, that we would pay for. And we're like cheap, typically. AWS costs shouldn't be, 100% of our profit margin. So I think that is something that I'm quite proud of, other than all the other API integrations and all the API technology that we've put in there, not only the REST API server, but the gRPC one, the GraphQL one in there also. All of that tech that we built is really interesting, but I think the pricing model is key.
Yeah, there's a lot of rabbit holes that I think we could poke our way into, and maybe a good reason to have you come chat with us again sometime soon, Roy. Where's the best place to find you online?
So Roy at Unified.to is my email address. Reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, of course. You can find my coordinates pretty easily. And I'm very out here in the Toronto tech scene. Love to talk to other tech entrepreneurs. Obviously, very passionate about APIs, but I'm also very passionate about the tech ecosystem anywhere and tech entrepreneurs as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And the final question I usually ask before wrapping is, are you hiring? And if so, what sorts of folks are you looking for?
Yeah, we are hiring. So again, we're 5 months old. We are halfway through raising our pre-seed round right now, our first round of financing. And we're 4 people right now, and we're hiring a fifth. We're hiring what we're calling a customer success manager, basically post sales, API, technical, but not coder. List loves to work with customers, get them to implement our API and technology.
Got it. Oh, that's fantastic. Well, if that sounds like you and you're listening to this, we will make sure that Roy's contact information is all over the show notes, just as well as just as well as links to get to Unified, as well as the promo code to get 3 months of free access with their startup plan. So make sure you check the show notes to grab those. Roy, it's been fantastic having you chat with us and hang out. Would love to have you back and talk about where things are in 6 months, 3 months, a year, whatever it may be, and kind of see how things are going for you. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Hey, thanks, guys.
All right. Take care.
Yeah, cheers, everyone.